Good evening, everyone. Today we're diving into something fundamental, not just for success, but for self-mastery, the science of making and breaking habits. And I'll walk you through 5 key signs that signal whether a habit is forming, breaking down, or needs strategic intervention. We're not just talking psychology here. We're diving into neurobiology, dopamine dynamics, behavioral reinforcement, and circadian patterns, all backed by cutting-edge science. One of the foundational truths about behavior, both positive and negative, is that no action happens in isolation. Every behavior is part of a larger loop, and at the core of that loop is what we call the cue or trigger. It's the spark that activates a behavioral pattern, and while it may seem small or irrelevant, the cue plays one of the most powerful roles in how habits are formed, maintained, or disrupted. Cues can take many forms: a time of day, an emotional state, a place, a person, or even something internal like a bodily sensation. The nervous system is constantly processing thousands of signals every second: subtle environmental changes, sensory inputs, internal states, and among these signals, certain ones get tagged as meaningful because they've been paired with past experiences of reward or relief. These are the ones that become cues. For example, if you always check your phone the moment you feel slightly bored, your brain starts wiring the sensation of boredom with the reward of novelty and stimulation. Over time, the cue boredom becomes unconsciously linked to the behavior checking the phone, which releases dopamine, a neurochemical associated with pleasure, motivation, and learning. This process of associating a cue with a behavior and its outcome is deeply rooted in a brain structure called the basal ganglia. Specifically, the dorsolateral striatum is responsible for detecting and encoding these stimulus-response patterns. Once a habit loop is formed, the behavior often bypasses conscious thought. It becomes automatic. In neuroscience, we refer to this process as chunking. The brain begins to treat a sequence of actions as a single unit. So rather than actively deciding each time whether to engage in a behavior, your brain just runs the script as soon as the cue appears. This is highly efficient and allows us to conserve mental energy, but it also means that bad habits can become deeply entrenched and harder to break. Now, here's where it gets particularly interesting from a practical perspective. If you want to build a new habit, something as simple as drinking more water, or as complex as starting a consistent workout routine, the key is to deliberately design a strong cue. The more consistent and specific the cue, the faster the brain will recognize the pattern and start to wire it. Let's take an example. If you want to develop a habit of stretching every morning, don't just decide to stretch. Attach it to a precise cue. I will stretch immediately after I brush my teeth in the morning. Brushing your teeth becomes the trigger. Because it's something you already do without fail, it provides a stable foundation for anchoring a new behavior. Over time, your nervous system will begin to expect the stretch immediately following the toothbrushing routine, and eventually the stretch will feel incomplete or awkward if skipped. Because the habit loop is now in place, there is also a biochemical layer to all of this. Cues, especially when linked to past rewards, trigger the release of dopamine in areas like the nucleus accumbens. This surge of dopamine doesn't just make you feel good. It strengthens the synaptic connections associated with that behavior. It's the brain's way of saying, remember this, it's important. However, when we talk about breaking bad habits, the cue becomes the most critical target. You cannot break a habit by sheer willpower alone. You have to start by either eliminating the cue or by altering the behavioral response to that cue. If you always overeat while watching TV at night, then sitting in front of the TV becomes the cue. To change the behavior, you either need to remove the trigger, e.g., stop watching TV during that time, or rewire the loop by inserting a different behavior, e.g., drinking tea or journaling instead of snacking. What this tells us is that cues are predictive. Your brain wants to know what's coming next, and it's always seeking patterns that reduce uncertainty. By mastering the use of cues, designing them for good habits, and disrupting them for harmful ones, you take control of the initiation point of every habit loop. Ultimately, habit formation is not about motivation or willpower. It's about structure and signal. When you manage the cues effectively, the rest of the loop falls into place more smoothly. Understanding and manipulating cues is one of the most powerful neuroscience-backed strategies for true behavioral change. When discussing the science of habits, it's impossible to ignore one of the most influential neurochemicals in the brain, dopamine. Contrary to what many believe, dopamine is not the molecule of pleasure. It's the molecule of motivation, craving, pursuit, and reinforcement. It plays a pivotal role in shaping habits by encoding what's known as reward prediction error, essentially teaching the brain what behaviors are worth repeating based on the outcomes they produce or anticipate. Dopamine is produced primarily in a set of neurons located in the ventral tegmental area, VTA, of the midbrain. These neurons project to multiple brain regions, including the nucleus accumbens, prefrontal cortex, and dorsal striatum, each of which contributes to different aspects of decision, making, action, and habit consolidation. Here's where it becomes critical for understanding how habits form. Dopamine is released not when we get the reward, but when we anticipate it. If you regularly eat chocolate after dinner and it gives you pleasure, your brain begins to predict that pleasure as soon as dinner ends. Over time, just finishing dinner can cause a spike in dopamine before the chocolate even touches your tongue. That spike creates motivation to act, reinforcing the behavior loop. This mechanism is called dopaminergic anticipation, and it is central to both building and breaking habits. It's not about the reward itself, it's about the learned expectation of reward. The more consistently a certain cue and behavior are followed by a positive outcome, the stronger the dopamine-driven prediction becomes. This prediction then causes you to crave the behavior, often subconsciously, which is why so many habits feel automatic. From a neuroscientific perspective, each time the brain is correct in its reward prediction, it strengthens that loop. But if the prediction is wrong, let's say you expect chocolate after dinner, and it's not available, the brain experiences a dopamine dip. This is experienced as frustration, agitation, or discomfort. That emotional reaction is neurological feedback. The brain is signaling that something expected didn't happen, and it's now updating its prediction map. The more you repeat a habit and the more consistent the reward, the stronger and faster this dopamine cycle becomes. It explains why we are drawn to certain routines and why they become difficult to break, even when we know they are unhealthy or unproductive. There's also a concept called dopamine stacking that can intensify this effect. If you pair multiple rewarding stimuli like eating while watching a favorite show or scrolling social media while sipping a sugary drink, you create an amplified release of dopamine. This makes the combined experience far more habit-forming than either component alone. It also makes it more difficult to undo because you're dealing with multiple sources of reinforcement at once. This is why breaking habits that involve dopamine, stacking like binge eating, doom scrolling, or video game addiction, can feel particularly draining. You're not just removing a behavior, you're shutting down a complex network of reward predictions that have been wired over time through repetition, consistency, and neurochemical payoff. But the good news is that dopamine can be redirected. The very same neurochemical that builds bad habits can also be used to build good ones, if you structure it intentionally. Let's say you want to build a habit of daily writing. The behavior itself might not initially produce a strong dopamine reward. But by celebrating small wins, tracking your streak, or pairing writing with another mild reward like listening to instrumental music, you can begin to build the anticipation loop. Over time, the brain begins to predict dopamine in response to the cue, sitting down to write, making the behavior more desirable. There's also the concept of effort-based dopamine, which is critical. Studies have shown that when we earn a reward through effort, the dopamine release is higher than when a reward is simply given. This is why challenge and progress are more motivating than passive rewards. The brain is designed to be most engaged when it works towards something and then achieves it. Understanding this dynamic gives us leverage. It means that rather than trying to force new habits through willpower, we can construct experiences that guide dopamine release. By managing timing, cues, effort, and small wins, we create the neural feedback necessary to make a habit desirable and sticky. Dopamine teaches the brain what's worth pursuing. If you consistently pair a behavior with anticipation and reward, that behavior will embed itself into your identity. If you remove the reward or interrupt the prediction, the behavior begins to weaken. It's all about how the brain interprets what matters. In the end, habit formation is less about discipline and more about managing the neurochemical language of motivation. And dopamine is that language. Repetition is often underestimated in conversations about habit formation. People think they need motivation, inspiration, or some kind of mental hack. But the real foundation of all habit formation lies in something much simpler and far more powerful: neural repetition. It's not just the behavior itself that matters, it's how often you repeat it, under what conditions, and with how much focus. Repetition is what allows the brain to rewire itself through a process we call experience-dependent plasticity. At the center of this is the concept of neuroplasticity, which refers to the brain's ability to change its structure and function based on experience. This change isn't metaphorical, it's physical. Every time you repeat a behavior, you activate a specific network of neurons. With enough repetition, those neurons begin to fire more easily, and the connections between them become stronger and faster. That network becomes your default pathway for that behavior. This process occurs largely in the cortex, especially the motor cortex, prefrontal cortex, and parts of the basal ganglia, depending on the type of habit. Early in the formation of a habit, these networks require effortful attention and coordination. You have to think through every step. But with repetition, the brain begins to offload those behaviors to more automatic regions, like the dorsolateral striatum. This transfer is important. It's the brain's way of conserving energy. If you had to consciously think through every single behavior each day, brushing your teeth, unlocking your phone, tying your shoes, you'd be mentally exhausted before breakfast. So the brain builds efficiency through automated circuitry, and it does that through consistent, focused repetition. A key component of this process is the role of myelin, a fatty substance that wraps around neural axons. The more often a neural circuit is used, the more myelin wraps around it. This insulation speeds up the transmission of signals along that pathway, essentially making the behavior faster, easier, and more automatic. This is why the saying "neurons that fire together wire together" is not just poetic, it's literal. Now, repetition alone isn't enough. It has to be contextual and consistent. The brain learns best when the same behavior is repeated in the same setting. That's because context such as time of day, location, and even emotional state provides anchor points for habit memory. If you work out at the same time every morning, in the same environment, with the same music, your brain starts to bundle all of those cues together. Eventually, simply entering that context will trigger the habit loop, often without any conscious decision making. One thing people often overlook is that the brain doesn't distinguish between good and bad habits when it comes to repetition. It simply responds to frequency and reward prediction. If you repeatedly reach for your phone when you're stressed, the brain strengthens that loop in the same way it would for a positive habit like daily meditation. It's agnostic. That's why awareness of repetition is critical, not just in building good habits, but in avoiding the repetition of bad ones. Another important factor is attention. Repetition that's accompanied by deliberate focus leads to faster and deeper plasticity. If you perform a behavior mindlessly, the change in neural circuitry is weaker. But if you engage in the behavior with full attention, especially in the early stages, you're sending a stronger signal to the brain. This matters. Lock this in. In fact, studies have shown that when subjects perform a repeated task while paying attention to the movement, the corresponding brain regions show greater synaptic density and stronger cortical maps. This is especially true in motor learning, where attention accelerates the transition from conscious effort to automatic execution. This brings us to a critical point in behavior change. When trying to form a new habit, repetition should be intentional, context-driven, and paired with positive reinforcement. The early stages may feel awkward or difficult. That's expected. Your brain is literally rewiring itself. But once a behavior has been repeated enough times under consistent conditions, the brain no longer needs to expend as much energy to execute it. It becomes a default setting. To summarize, the brain is a pattern recognition machine. Repetition teaches it what patterns are worth keeping. And once that pattern has been repeated enough times, ideally in a stable context, with attention and reward, it becomes encoded in your neural circuitry. From there, it no longer relies on willpower. It becomes who you are. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. It's not about how hard you do it, it's about how often you do it. Repetition is what tells your brain, this behavior is important. Make it easier, make it faster, make it automatic, and it will. One of the most misunderstood aspects of habit change is the resistance we face when trying to break a behavior that no longer serves us. Many people interpret this resistance as a personal failing, lack of willpower, weakness, or laziness. But what's actually happening is far more physiological and predictable. The nervous system is undergoing withdrawal from a previously reinforced behavior loop. When a habit becomes wired into the brain, especially one associated with high levels of dopamine release, it doesn't just live in the realm of preference or routine. It becomes integrated into the brain's reward prediction system, meaning the brain doesn't just respond to the behavior itself, it begins to anticipate it. This anticipation is what creates the powerful pull towards certain habits, whether it's eating late at night, scrolling endlessly on your phone, or smoking a cigarette. The moment you try to interrupt that loop, the brain responds with a prediction error. In neuroscience, prediction error occurs when an expected reward doesn't arrive. When this happens, dopamine levels dip below baseline, which is a biologically aversive state. In simple terms, it doesn't just feel like the absence of a reward, it feels like a loss. This is the neurological foundation of withdrawal. Withdrawal is not limited to substance addictions. It occurs anytime you remove a habitual behavior that previously provided some form of internal reward, pleasure, comfort, distraction, or relief. The symptoms vary depending on the individual and the habit, but they commonly include irritability, mental fatigue, craving, difficulty focusing, and even low mood. These are signs that your brain is recalibrating its reward system, and it's struggling to regain balance. Importantly, these symptoms are not a sign to stop. In fact, they're a sign that change is underway. One of the key regions involved in this recalibration is the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for executive function, self-control, and delayed gratification. When you try to break a habit, especially a deeply wired one, the prefrontal cortex has to work harder to override the automatic impulse generated by the dorsal striatum, the habit execution center of the brain, but this cognitive effort is metabolically expensive. It requires glucose, oxygen, and neurotransmitters like norepinephrine and acetylcholine to maintain focus and inhibition. That's why, when breaking a habit, many people feel mentally exhausted or drained. The brain is literally burning more energy trying to maintain control. This is also why stress often triggers relapse. When the brain is under stress, cortisol levels rise, and the prefrontal cortex's functioning is impaired. Meanwhile, the limbic system, specifically the amygdala and striatum, takes over. In this state, the brain defaults to its most well-rehearsed, dopamine-rich behaviors, which are often the very habits you're trying to eliminate. This isn't weakness, this is biology. So, what do we do with this knowledge? First, we need to normalize the discomfort of habit change. Expecting the brain to feel neutral when you eliminate a rewarding behavior is unrealistic. In fact, that discomfort is an indication that the brain is doing its job. It's trying to adapt to a new behavioral reality. The withdrawal period is a window of neuroplastic potential. It's when the old pathway is vulnerable and a new one can be established if the right conditions are in place. Second, this is where replacement behaviors become essential. You cannot simply remove a habit and leave a void. The brain craves resolution. Instead of trying to fight the craving directly, you reroute it. If you normally reach for your phone when bored, replace that behavior with something that still activates your attention system, like walking, breath work, or even journaling. This engages similar neural circuits, helping the brain adapt without crashing the system. Finally, time and consistency are key. Studies have shown that it can take anywhere from 21 to 66 days or longer to fully rewire a habit loop, depending on its complexity and reinforcement history. But during this time, each moment of resistance builds prefrontal strength. Each time you override the old habit, even if briefly, you're laying down the neural scaffolding for a new behavior to take its place. So, if you're experiencing withdrawal symptoms while trying to break a habit, understand that you're not failing. You're not broken. What you're experiencing is the natural tension between old circuitry and new wiring. And with the right tools, environment, and self-awareness, your brain will adapt. It always does. One of the most pervasive myths in behavior change is the belief that success is primarily a function of willpower. We're often told that if we can just muster enough internal strength, we can force ourselves into new habits or out of old ones. But neuroscience paints a very different picture. Willpower, while real, is a limited biological resource, and depending on it alone is a fragile strategy for long-term change. Let's start with what willpower actually is. In neuroscientific terms, willpower is the top-down regulation of behavior, your brain's ability to override impulses in favor of longer-term goals. This ability largely originates in the prefrontal cortex, the brain region behind your forehead responsible for planning, decision-making, and self-control. It communicates with the limbic system, particularly the amygdala and striatum, which are responsible for emotional drives, habits, and cravings. When you're relying on willpower, what you're actually doing is increasing prefrontal cortical activation to suppress or redirect impulses coming from deeper, older parts of the brain. This kind of neural override is effortful and metabolically demanding. The prefrontal cortex burns through glucose and oxygen faster when it's actively managing self-control. That's why decisions feel harder at the end of a long day or when you're stressed, tired, or hungry. Your cognitive resources are simply depleted. This is known as ego depletion, though it's more accurately described as cognitive fatigue, and this is why relying solely on willpower is so unreliable. You might be able to override a craving in the morning when you're well rested, but that same craving might overwhelm you at night when your decision-making circuits are worn out. So, what does this mean for habit formation or habit breaking? It means that the real key to lasting behavior change is not forcing your way through it. It's designing your environment and systems so that willpower isn't required at every step. The brain is fundamentally a pattern detecting energy conserving organ. It wants to minimize effort. So, if your environment is constantly full of temptation or friction, you're fighting biology. But if your environment is structured to make the desired behavior the easiest or most obvious option, you're aligning with the brain's natural tendencies. For example, if you're trying to eat healthier, relying on willpower to resist junk food in your kitchen day after day is setting yourself up for decision fatigue. A better approach is to remove the cue, get the junk food out of the house, and place healthier options in visible, easy-to-reach places. This reduces the activation energy needed to perform the desired behavior. Activation energy is a term borrowed from physics and chemistry, but it applies beautifully to behavioral neuroscience. It refers to the initial energy required to start a task. High activation energy means more resistance, which means more reliance on willpower. But when you lower the activation energy by reducing steps, friction, or decisions, you increase the likelihood of the behavior becoming consistent. Another way to reduce dependence on willpower is to use implementation intentions, if-then plans that pre-wire your behavior in response to specific cues. For instance, if it's 7 a.m., I'll put on my workout clothes and stretch for 5 minutes. This works because the brain responds very well to conditioned patterns, especially when they're linked to consistent environmental or temporal cues. These micro-plans shift the load from effortful decision-making to automatic execution, which is where habits thrive. There's also a critical motivational component rooted in dopaminergic systems. Motivation is not about forcing yourself to act. It's about creating a system where small wins lead to dopamine release, which then motivates you to continue. When you structure your habits around achievable steps and acknowledge progress, you train your brain to crave the behavior itself, not just the outcome. This is especially important in the early phases of habit change, when the new neural circuits are still fragile. Small, frequent successes help reinforce the behavior through reward prediction and fulfillment, which strengthens synaptic pathways and accelerates the transition from conscious effort to automaticity. Ultimately, willpower should be viewed as a temporary tool, not a long-term strategy. It's like a match. You can use it to light the fire, but it won't keep the fire burning. For that, you need a system, a well-structured environment, consistent cues, minimized friction, and reinforcement mechanisms that support the behavior even when your internal resources are low. So, if you find yourself failing when trying to make a change, it's not because you lack discipline. It's because you're leaning on a system willpower that was never designed to carry the entire load. The brain doesn't need more force, it needs better scaffolding, and once the system is aligned, the behavior follows. One of the most overlooked yet powerful drivers of lasting habit formation is identity, not in the philosophical sense, but in the deeply biological and psychological sense. Our identity, or who we believe we are, is not just a mental story. It's a construct tied directly to our neurological patterns, behavior loops, and even hormonal states. When a habit aligns with our identity, it becomes stable. When it conflicts with who we believe we are, the nervous system resists even if the behavior is objectively beneficial. This alignment or misalignment between behavior and identity is one of the reasons habits either stick or collapse. If someone starts waking up early to exercise but still sees themselves as not a morning person, they are engaging in a neurological tug-of-war. The body is doing one thing, but the self-representation encoded in the brain is pushing against it. Over time, this internal conflict leads to fatigue, inconsistency, or total abandonment of the new behavior. So how does the brain actually encode identity? Much of this involves default mode network, DMN activity, a brain network responsible for self-reflection, imagination, and autobiographical memory. When we think or speak about ourselves, statements like "I am disciplined" or "I always procrastinate," we're activating this network and reinforcing certain beliefs. These beliefs are not passive. They shape the expectation and prediction systems in the brain, particularly in the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, which influence how we perceive challenges, opportunities, and ourselves in relation to them. This identity circuitry becomes tightly integrated with habitual behavior loops. If you see yourself as a runner, lacing up your shoes in the morning isn't a struggle, it's a confirmation of who you are. But if you still identify as someone who's inconsistent or lazy, then even when you do run, it feels foreign. You might even subconsciously sabotage yourself, because the behavior doesn't fit the internal narrative. This is what we call identity dissonance. The brain naturally resists behaviors that contradict your self-image, even if those behaviors are good for you. This is not due to weakness, it's due to a survival mechanism. The brain is wired for coherence. It seeks consistency between belief and behavior because coherence lowers cognitive load and makes decision-making more efficient. But here's where things get exciting. Identity is malleable, it's not fixed, and like any network in the brain, it can be rewired through experience, intention, and repetition. In fact, every time you perform a new behavior, you are not just influencing your external actions. You're giving your brain evidence that a new identity may be forming. These moments act as votes for for a new version of yourself. Do it enough, and the brain starts updating the internal model. The key is to pair action with awareness. It's not enough to change what you do, you have to notice and internalize what that action means. For example, if you're building a habit of reading every day, don't just finish a book and move on. Tell yourself, I'm the kind of person who finishes what I start. That self-directed narrative strengthens the prefrontal, hippocampal loop, reinforcing a new identity map. There's also a strong neurochemical component here. Every time you act in accordance with a new identity and reward yourself for it, even mentally, you get a dopamine reinforcement. That reinforcement strengthens the behavior, yes, but it also begins to anchor that behavior to the self. Over time, this transforms motivation from being externally driven to internally generated, from discipline to desire. This is why many people struggle when trying to adopt habits through external motivation alone. If the behavior isn't rooted in identity, it always feels like effort. But when it becomes part of how you define yourself, the energy required drops dramatically. You're no longer pushing the behavior is being pulled by who you believe you are. So how do you intentionally shift identity? Start with small, consistent actions that reflect the person you want to become. Don't focus on the end goal, focus on the process. With each repetition, pair the behavior with a conscious narrative. This is like me. Over time, that story gets hardwired. The habit and the identity become one. This isn't just psychology, it's biology. The nervous system adapts based on repeated inputs. Behavior shapes belief, and belief stabilizes behavior. When those two align, you become unstoppable. Not because you're exerting willpower, but because your system is finally coherent. In the end, the most powerful habits are the ones that don't just change your day. They change your sense of self. And once that happens, lasting change becomes inevitable.